So what is the link between sustainable development and green growth? And let me start with a quick definition of what we mean by green growth. There are many fancy and complex definitions we could come up, and they're all wonderful. But fundamentally, all we're talking about is growth that is environmentally sustainable. And if we go back to the three pillars of sustainable development, economic, social, and environmental, we've seen a big culture change over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, it used to be people thought you have to grow first and then you distributed and worried about social issues later. And then the realization came that growth is good for social objective, for distribution, but social policies are also good for growth. You grow better, you grow differently when you have an educated population, when you have lower inequality. What we're trying to accomplish with this idea of green growth is really the same thing that happened with social and economic policy. It's really to bring people's attention to the fact that when we talk about the environment, we're really talking about natural capital. We're talking about an input into our production function, an input into our economy, our economies, and our ability to grow. The big question is, can we grow greener without necessarily growing a lot slower? And let's unpack this question a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier, there's plenty of inefficiencies in our economic system. If you look at our transportation system, when people live far away from work, spend hours in individual cars, that is not efficient. When we subsidize energy, fossil fuel energy, when we subsidize the electricity that's used for irrigation, for example, these are simply not efficient. They're not good for growth and they're not good for the environment. OECD, ourselves, and others have estimated that there's at least $1.3, $1.4 trillion that are spent every year in environmentally harmful subsidies. Getting rid of those would be good for growth, would be good for the environment, and in many cases would actually be socially desirable. So that's one set of things. The second is that we really need to think about the environment as natural capital, as something that we need to invest in. And we've got a number of examples where better environmental management immediately led to increased growth, because when you're managing your soil better, when you're managing your water resources better, this enables you to produce more and better. And finally, it's really critical also that we do the needed interventions when they can occur at least cost. So in developing countries, many countries are now building the infrastructure that they will use for decades, possibly centuries in the future. Building it right today can mean a lot less cost later on, either because of vulnerability to climate change or because of changes in price of fossil fuel or other things. The first one is a cultural one. People are so used to measuring progress via GDP. Now, no private firm would go to the market, would try to value itself by simply showing its income statement, which is what GDP is. It's an income statement. Every firm also has an asset account. So we believe that we should have, as countries, we should have the equivalent of an asset account, which is a measure of wealth. Wealth is basically the combination of human capital, physical capital, and natural capital, as well as possibly social capital. So it's absolutely critical that we have a measure of wealth. So number one is moving people from a narrow focus on GDP to a measure of wealth. The second challenge is theoretical. How do you construct a single indicator? And single synthetic indicators have their flaws, but they're also important in communicating. It's necessary to have them. They're necessary, non-sufficient. And there's some real difficulties in finding the right way of aggregating. A third one is a policy one, which is, if you have your synthetic indicator, is that really useful for policy reasons? And you probably need to have a very good set of underlying indicator where you can try to see the impact of your policy. You can't wait to see an impact on the aggregate indicator. The fourth one is a practical one, and that is one that to us at the World Bank matters particularly because in developing countries there's very little data, often particularly on natural capital and environmental issues.